I wasn't looking for underground steam networks when I started this investigation. I was researching something far more mundane: the heating infrastructure of 19th century municipal buildings in Central Europe, boiler rooms, pipe manifolds, the kind of dry technical history that fills the footnotes of civil engineering journals and nothing else. I was trying to understand why so many public buildings constructed between 1850 and 1890 seemed to share identical mechanical room layouts, even when they were separated by thousands of miles and built by entirely different administrations. That was the question. A boring question by most standards. Then I found the tunnels. Not on a map, not in a civic engineering report. I found them in a series of decommissioned maintenance photographs held in a private archive in Leipzig. Photographs that have been mislabeled as drainage infrastructure, provenance unknown, filed alongside mundane municipal water records and never digitized, never indexed, never studied. The photographs showed something that had no business existing in the 1870s. Cast iron junctions of extraordinary complexity, pressure regulation chambers with gauge arrays that would have required precision machining beyond what the official historical record credits to that era, and running beneath at least for major European cities, connected to identical terminal chambers whose design matched nothing in any engineering textbook I had ever encountered. I hired a translator. I contacted 2 retired civil engineers. I submitted inquiries to 3 separate university archives, and one by one, the official explanations began to collapse. What I had found wasn't a drainage anomaly. It wasn't a misidentified coal gas system. What I had found was the edge of something vast, something that had been deliberately reduced to silence, a network, a system, and the fingerprints of a civilization that the history books have spent 200 years pretending did not exist. The photographs from Leipzig were taken sometime between 1871 and 1883, based on the dry plate glass negative process used and the oxidation patterns on the photographic emulsion. There are 47 images in total. I had each one analyzed independently by 2 photographic historians, neither of whom knew about the other's involvement. Both confirmed the same conclusion. The images predated the chemical and mechanical technology required to fabricate them. These were not reproductions. These were not composite prints. These were original photographs of something that genuinely existed beneath the streets of at least one Central European city during the latter half of the 19th century. What do the photographs show? The first thing you notice is the scale. The main corridor visible in the longest exposure, captured with magnesium flash from what appears to be a junction chamber, measures approximately 4 meters in diameter. 4 meters! For reference, the London sewer system, celebrated as a marvel of Victorian engineering and completed in 1865, used brick-lined tunnels averaging between 1 and 2 meters in diameter. The Leipzig tunnels are not sewers. The walls are not brick. They are lined with a pale ceramic material, smooth and jointless over stretches of 8 to 12 feet, with expansion joint space at intervals that suggest a working knowledge of thermodynamics well beyond what contemporary engineering manuals describe. The pipes are the detail that stops you cold, running along the upper third of the tunnel walls, held in iron cradles bolted directly into the ceramic lining, are pressurized pipe assemblies of diameter and complexity that match nothing in the standard catalog of 19th century industrial infrastructure. The flange joints use a multi-bolt pattern, 12 bolts per flange in photographs, where I could count clearly, a configuration that does not appear in any European pipe manufacturing catalog until the early 20th century, and then only in high-pressure steam applications for naval engineering, in a tunnel beneath a Central European city. In 1875, I submitted measurements derived from the photographs to a mechanical engineer who spent 30 years working in industrial steam systems. He examined the pipe dimensions, the gauge housing shapes, and the visible pressure indicator scales. His response was careful but unambiguous. The system, if functional, would have operated at pressures between 60 and 120 pounds per square inch. That is not a heating system. That is not a gas distribution network. That is the pressure range of a working steam distribution grid. The kind of centralized thermal energy infrastructure that, according to every mainstream history of technology, did not exist in municipal applications until New York City's Consolidated Edison began its famous Manhattan Steam Network in 1882. And even that is considered the first of its kind, except that the Leipzig photographs appear to show something older, something already built, something already in use, or recently decommissioned. The gauge indicators in 3 of the photographs are reading 0, not broken, not missing, reading 0, as if recently bled of pressure, as if someone had shut the system down before someone else could photograph it running. The official explanation, when I eventually traced it through 2 layers of archival correspondence, was that the photographs depicted an experimental drainage pressure testing facility that was never completed and subsequently demolished. No completion records, no demolition permits, no engineering firm named as contractor, no budget appropriation in any city ledger I was able to locate for the relevant period. Just a claim, typed on a single sheet of institutional letterhead, with no signature. I've spent enough time in archives to know what a real administrative explanation looks like. This was not one. This was the shape of a door, being quietly closed. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I might have accepted the Leipzig photographs as an isolated curiosity if the pattern had stopped there. It did not stop there. Within 8 months of beginning this investigation, I had identified structural analogs, tunnel systems with matching ceramic lining profiles, identical pipe cradle configurations, and the same 12-bolt flange pattern in records connected to at least 6 other cities. St. Petersburg, Russia, where a series of sub-basement maintenance corridors beneath the old administrative quarter along the Nevsky Prospect were documented in imperial surveying records from 1841 and then redacted from all subsequent editions of the same survey without explanation. Buenos Aires, Argentina, where construction workers expanding the metro system in 1994 broke through into a pre-existing ceramic line tunnel running parallel to their excavation at depth of 11 meters, a tunnel that city engineers quietly sealed and reclassified as a colonial-era drainage feature despite its obvious dissimilarity to any colonial drainage infrastructure in the region. Delhi, India, where British colonial surveying teams in 1858 documented anomalous subterranean passages of unknown origin beneath the old city, passages lined with material the survey report describes as a smooth white compound, neither brick nor plaster, resistant to hammer testing. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The ceramic lining appears in St. Petersburg, in Buenos Aires, in Delhi. The pipe cradle bolt spacing, which I was able to verify in 3 independent photographic sources from 3 different continents, matches to within millimeters. The tunnel diameters fall within the same range, 3.8 to 4.2 meters, consistently. And in each location, the documentation trail follows the same arc: initial discovery or survey, brief official acknowledgement, then reclassification, reattribution to a mundane cause, and silence. The connection to a single time period is what makes this impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Every documented encounter with these structures, every survey record, every maintenance photograph, every accidental construction discovery that made it into any written record before being quietly reclassified, clusters in the same window. The 1830s through the 1890s, 60 years, across 4 continents. A single unified infrastructure profile, repeating in cities that had no documented communication, no shared engineering tradition, no acknowledged common origin. The proportions match. The materials match. The pressure specifications match. A network does not build itself in fragments. A network is planned. It is engineered from a single coherent design, and a design that's sophisticated, executed at that scale, across that geography, in that time period, demands a question that mainstream history has never been willing to answer. Who were they built for? Pull out any major European atlas published between 1600 and 1800, not a modern reprint, an original. You will find, spread across the interior of the Eurasian continent, a territory labeled with a name that has been systematically excised from every geography textbook printed after approximately 1920. Tartaria, sometimes Tartary, sometimes Grand Tartary or Mogul Tartary or Chinese Tartary, depending on the map and the era, but always there, always large. In some atlases, the largest labeled territory on the entire Eurasian landmass, stretching from the Caspian Sea to Pacific coast, from the Arctic South to the Himalayan foothills. Not a legend, not a myth, a named, mapped, administratively acknowledged geopolitical entity that appears on the official cartographic record of every major European power for over 200 years. The maps are real. The cartographers were real: Mercator, Blau, Sanson, or Telius. These were not imaginative illustrators filling blank space with fantasy. These were the precision instruments of statecraft used by governments to plan trade routes, military campaigns, and diplomatic correspondence. Tartaria appears on their maps because Tartaria was there, and then it disappears. Not conquered. There is no campaign documented in any military archive that accounts for the subjugation of a territory that size. Not renamed. No successor state of comparable geographic scope appears in its place on subsequent maps. Not gradually reduced by treaty and partition. The transition is not gradual at all. By the mid-19th century, the maps simply change. The name is gone. The territory is redistributed into smaller administrative labels without acknowledgement of what those labels replaced. And the academic discipline of history moves forward, as if the question of what occupied that space for 2 centuries was never worth asking. Now consider the geography of the steam tunnel network. The tunnel profiles I documented in St. Petersburg, in Delhi, in cities across the Eurasian corridor. What territory do those cities border? What trade and administrative network would have connected them during the period when those tunnels were apparently operational? The overlap with the historical cartographic footprint of Tartaria becomes impossible to ignore. A civilization capable of mapping and administering territory across that span would have required infrastructure. It would have required energy distribution. It would have required exactly the kind of centralized, pressurized, underground thermal network that the Leipzig photograph suggests. The steam tunnels are not a curiosity separate from the question of Tartaria. They may be one of the most concrete physical remnants of what Tartaria actually was. The documentary record, what survives of it, tells a story that is all the more compelling for how abruptly it ends. The St. Louis Industrial Gazette, 1879. A correspondent reporting from a trade exposition in Vienna describes, in passing, touring a demonstration of what he calls a subterranean thermal conveyance, a system he says had been operating in an unspecified Central European city for no fewer than 30 years, which replaced its installation no later than 1849. He describes tile-lined passages, regulated heat emerging from floor gratings, and gauges of a design unlike any manufactured by the principal instrument houses of London or Hamburg. The article runs to 4 paragraphs and is never followed up. The Gazette's archive for the 1880s shows no further coverage of the topic. The Edinburgh Engineering Review, 1884. A technical correspondent submits a detailed account of inspecting pre-existing subterranean pipework discovered during municipal expansion works in an unnamed Eastern European city. He provides pipe diameter measurements, consistent with the Leipzig photographs, and notes that the flange connections use a 12-bolt arrangement not found in the published specifications of any British, German, or French manufacturer. He expresses bewilderment. The editorial board of the review appends a note stating that the correspondent's findings have been referred to appropriate municipal authorities for clarification. The clarification is never published. The Buenos Aires Commercial Herald, 1887. A brief notice reports that workers excavating the foundations for a new government building had encountered passages of smooth stone, apparently very old, connected to iron fittings of unknown purpose. The notice is 4 sentences long. The following week's edition contains no follow-up. The edition after that carries a correction stating that the passages have been assessed by city engineers and determined to be natural limestone formations. Natural limestone, with iron fittings. The Delhi Surveyor's Quarterly, published by the British Colonial Administration, 1861. A formal survey report documents 3 separate underground passages encountered during construction of administrative buildings in the old city quarter. The report includes elevation drawings showing the tunnel profile, 4 meters diameter, ceramic lining, pipe cradles along the upper wall, and recommends further investigation. A marginal notation in a different hand, added later, reads simply, "Matter resolved. File closed." No resolution document is attached. The Calcutta Engineering Bulletin, 1903. A retired surveyor writes a letter to the editor describing his discovery during his active career in the 1870s of similar passages beneath two cities in northern India. He states that he had been instructed by his superior officers never to include the passages in official survey records, and that he is writing now in retirement, because the truth of what we found deserves acknowledgement before all who knew of it are gone. The letter is published. No response from the editorial board appears. No subsequent correspondence on the subject is printed. After approximately 1920, the reports stop, the photographs stop, the survey notations stop, the letters to editors stop. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. It is not that the tunnel ceased to be discovered. Cities continued expanding. Foundations continued to be dug. Ground continued to be broken. It is that the reporting ceased. Simultaneously, across multiple countries, multiple languages, multiple professional disciplines, as if a decision had been made at some level above the individual correspondent or surveyor, that this particular category of discovery was no longer to be acknowledged. The Smithsonian Institution's Department of Anthropology acquisition records for the period 1890 to 1930 show a striking pattern. A significant volume of architectural material samples received from field correspondents across Eurasia and South America, cataloged under acquisition numbers that have since been marked deaccessioned, storage rationalization, material that was collected, material that was studied, and material that was then removed from the accessible record. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the steam network was not built by the civilizations we credit with its era? What if the tunnels beneath St. Petersburg, Delhi, Buenos Aires, and Central Europe are not the ambitious experiments of 19th century municipal engineers, but the inherited infrastructure of an earlier civilization, one that had developed centralized thermal energy distribution at a scale and sophistication that our current historical framework has no category for? What if the engineers and surveyors who encountered these tunnels in the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s were not building something new, but rediscovering something old? This would explain the ceramic lining that resists standard material dating. It would explain the 12-bolt flange configuration that appears in no manufacturer's catalog of the period. It would explain why the gauge arrays in the Leipzig photographs show pressure ratings that exceed what any contemporaneous boiler technology could safely generate, because they were not designed for contemporaneous boiler technology. They were designed for something that came before. And why would this be erased? Think about what the existence of a functioning global infrastructure implies. It implies a predecessor civilization of extraordinary technical capability. It implies that the political and industrial powers of the 19th century, empires built on a narrative of human progress, of civilization advancing from primitive origins toward modern achievement, were operating on top of a foundation they had not built and could not explain. The existence of Tartaria's steam network would not merely complicate the historical record. It would demolish the entire premise on which those empires justified their authority, the idea that they represented the apex of human development. You do not debate evidence that dangerous to your legitimacy. You reclassify it. You lose it. You close the file. They don't debate this. That is the first thing you notice when you attempt to introduce this evidence into any formal academic context. They don't engage with the photographs. They don't respond to the survey records. They don't explain the Buenos Aires ceramic tunnel or the Delhi pipe cradles. They pretend it never existed. I submitted a formal research inquiry to the Archives Division of a major European engineering institution. I will not name it here, because naming it would allow them to issue a denial that functions as its own kind of burial. The response I received after 11 weeks was a single paragraph stating that my inquiry fell outside the scope of holdings relevant to the institution's research mandate. Not a denial that the records existed. Not a claim that the photographs were inauthentic. A redirect. A door quietly closed. It's not active suppression. It's passive erasure. And passive erasure is, in many ways, more effective than active suppression. Active suppression requires coordination, effort, and leaves its own trail of evidence. Passive erasure requires only that institutions agree, implicitly and without any formal instruction, to simply not engage, to not catalog, to not index, to file under provenance unknown and move on, to mark acquisition records as deaccession, without specifying what was deaccessioned or where it went. I've spoken with 3 independent researchers who arrived at the same body of evidence through entirely different starting points. One through architectural history, one through industrial archaeology, one through cartographic research on pre-19th century Eurasian trade networks. All 3 describe the same experience when they attempt to publish. Not rejection. Exactly, something more insidious. Editors who express interest and then go silent. Peer reviewers whose comments address peripheral methodological questions and never engage with the central evidence. Conferences where their proposed papers are listed as under consideration indefinitely. The academic apparatus does not crush inquiry. It simply lets it sit unacknowledged until the inquirer gives up or moves on, across disciplines, across countries, across more than a century of accumulated anomalies. The silence is not the silence of ignorance. Ignorance produces confusion, debate, the energetic rawness of people who think they know the answer. This silence is different. This is a silence of people who know exactly what the question implies, and have decided, collectively and without instruction, that the question must not be allowed to produce an answer. There is one more category of evidence that I have not yet addressed, and it is in some ways the most quietly devastating of all: the tools. In a collection of a private industrial museum in Bruges, Belgium, a museum that has never been digitized, never been the subject of academic study, and which I visited after following a reference in a footnote of a 1923 Belgian Engineering Society yearbook. There are 43 hand tools acquired in the 1880s from a demolition project in the city's Old Harbor district. The museum's own label describes them as pipe-fitting implements, origin uncertain. I spent 2 days with those tools and a set of calipers. The wrenches in the collection are sized for a bolt head diameter of 31 millimeters. That is not a standard metric size. It is not a standard imperial size. It corresponds to no wrench sizing convention used by any European or American toolmaker in the 19th century. I checked against 4 separate tool manufacturer catalogs from the period held in the same museum's reference library. But it corresponds exactly to the bolt head size implied by the flanged dimensions visible in the Leipzig photographs. The tools were made for the tunnels. Or rather, the tools and the tunnels were made for each other, by the same hands, under the same specifications, as part of the same unified system. 3 of the wrenches have maker's marks, not stamped, but cast directly into the iron, suggesting they were produced by a foundry with access to precision casting technology. The marks are not in any Western European script. I photographed them and submitted them to a specialist in historical Central Asian scripts. Her assessment: the characters are consistent with a Turkic administrative notation system used in pre-19th century Eurasian trade documentation, but the specific form is unlike any documented variant she could identify from known sources. The auction catalog for which the museum originally acquired the collection, dated 1887, lists the tools under the heading Effects of Unknown Provenance recovered during harbor works, and assigns them a reserve price of 4 Belgian francs. The price is scrap iron. Someone thought they were valueless. Someone was wrong about what they were, or wanted others to think they were wrong. And suddenly the wrenches in a Belgian museum aren't an anomaly anymore. They're confirmation. I come back, always, to the tunnels themselves, not the photographs of them, not the records of them. The physical fact that they exist, sealed beneath streets that hundreds of thousands of people walk every day, running beneath the foundations of buildings that governments occupy, connecting cities whose official histories contain no trace of any shared engineering origin. The tunnels are still there. The ceramic lining is still there. The pipe cradles, empty of their pipes now, are still there. You can close a file. You can deaccession a collection. You can decline to respond to a research inquiry. But you cannot make 4 meters of smooth ceramic tunnel disappear from beneath a city. And so I am left with questions, not conclusions. I don't have definitive answers, only questions. But the questions themselves are worth sitting with. Why does the 12-bolt flange configuration appear in photographs from Leipzig, in survey descriptions from Delhi, in the verbal accounts of a retired colonial engineer writing to a Calcutta journal in 1903, when no manufacturer's catalog from any of those regions, in any of those eras, listed as a standard? Why do the tunnel diameters match across 4 continents, to within 400 millimeters, when there was no acknowledged international engineering standard governing subterranean construction until the 20th century. Why did the report stop in 1920? Not taper off. Not gradually decline as the mystery was resolved. Stop, simultaneously, as if someone had turned a valve. Why does the territory that appears on 200 years of European cartography as Tartaria, labeled, mapped, administratively acknowledged, vanish in the historical record, without a conquest, without a treaty, without the kind of paper trail that every other territorial transition in the modern era leaves behind? And why do the geographic coordinates of the documented steam tunnel encounters trace so precisely along the administrative and trade corridors that those same maps indicate as the arteries of that territory? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies, pattern. A pattern that stretches across continents and centuries, that hides in plain sight in private museum collections and mislabeled archival photographs and footnotes of engineering society yearbooks that nobody reads. A pattern that the institutions capable of investigating it have, with a consistency that is itself a kind of evidence, chosen not to investigate. We think of the past as something we understand. We think of history as a discipline that has done its work, that has gone back, examined the evidence, and given us an accurate account of how the world we inhabit came to be. But what if the world we inhabit is built on infrastructure we didn't build, in tunnels we didn't dig, according to specifications we can't explain, left behind by a civilization whose name has been removed from every map printed in the last 150 years? What have we forgotten? What were we helped to forget? And why does the forgetting follow such a precise and coordinated shape? I don't have answers. But somewhere beneath the streets of cities on 4 continents, sealed in ceramic-lined tunnels that 4 meters of earth have kept from the light for longer than our official history will admit, the evidence is still there, still waiting, still holding its pressure, still reading, on gauges that no one has checked in over a century, the exact specifications of a civilization that was supposed to disappear. The tunnels remain,